I will speak for 20 minutes, and then next 20 minutes, I will do Q&A. And we announced today that Prime Minister Modi is coming to Washington, D.C., and so we are hosting him on 7th of June, and 8th, he is doing a joint session with the Congress in the afternoon, and then hosting one more session with him, and then he flies out. I think the partnership between India and the U.S. is at a trajectory which seems to move upward bound, and I will get into that later. But let me first talk about India and its challenges and opportunity as a nation itself. By 2028, India will have a head count of around 1.46 billion people. It'll surpass China. It'll be the largest country on this planet from a population perspective. Today, its median age is 25, as compared to China, which is 34, Britain 40, or Germany 45, or in the US around 44. So that a median age of 25 represents an opportunity and a challenge for the country. And the reason I talk about that is today there are roughly 45 million Indians who are looking for a job in the job market. So that's one scenario. Roughly 1 million Indians are coming to the job market today every month. And this 1 month, a million will continue until 2030. The job market growth in today's economy is around 1.6%. That means the absorption rate is only 6 million a year compared to the 12 million coming to the job market. So that 47 million people, you'll add around 6 million people every year for the next 20 years unless something different is done to accelerate the job market. And if nothing is done, then the riots we saw in Gujarat with the Patels or Jats in Haryana and other part of geographies, you'll start seeing that coming up much, much more and creating much more a social instability in the country. So it is important for this government to accelerate the process because time is against itself because that tsunami of million a month will keep on coming itself. So that's one scenario. The second scenario which we are looking at is India will witness the largest migration of humans in its human history in the next 10 years. Roughly 400 million Indians will move from villages to the city looking for jobs. And for that, you have to have infrastructure which is in the education side, security side, healthcare, trying to deal with this massive movement of population from villages to the city. So you have two large mega trends taking place in the economy and the country itself, and the only solution is to go ahead and try to create jobs. I think the current growth rate of 7.4, 7.5 is not sufficient to create enough jobs, or that which is roughly has to be around 3% job creation on an annual basis. So India needs to grow between 9 and 10% minimum for the next 20 years to be able to move and create and manage that incoming tsunami itself. Let me give you the current scenario itself. World Bank, IMF, everybody has forecasted that India is growing around 7.4, 7.5%. FDI has gone up almost 40%, while on a global basis, it has dropped by almost 16%. If you look at inflation, has been checked, brought in below 5%, especially food inflation has come down substantially. The cost of tomatoes and onions, which do have an impact on common person, is under control. More important is, I think this government announced a I would say, a good budget, not a great budget, where it focused on fiscal deficit. So it's bringing its fiscal deficit from 3.9% of the GDP to 3.5 and hoping to take it to 3% next year. What that does, it releases money to be invested by the corporates, by the borrowing entities to build infrastructure and create more jobs. Now, what we are seeing is the Prime Minister has embarked on a lot of campaigns. You talk about the campaigns of Startup India, Make in India, Digital India. And I think when you look at all of them, they seem to connect in some manner, some fashion of creating jobs. Let's talk about Digital India. It's fascinating. India is one country today which has 1 billion people with the biometric data in its database in the Aadhaar project itself. So that's one. Second is by, I think, 2020, roughly 1 billion Indians will have smartphones. So if you connect the biometric to smartphone, you can basically revolutionize the digital side of the economy itself. So on Digital India, what the Prime Minister is trying to do is build up infrastructure in digital space. We work, US IBC, on 3 smart cities in India, which is Vizag, Allahabad, and Ajmer. And in Vizag, in partnership with Cisco, we've launched a broadband campaign where the charge is roughly $2 a month per house itself, the cheapest rate in the world. And I think if we can replicate this all across the country, you will see a massive revolution taking place on the digital side. I think the whole objective is to drive more and more services on the digital space. And I think that will bring what we are seeing is more transparency among the government bureaucrats. And I think 2 examples I can point out in the spectrum sale which took place. It was on an e-auction, transparent in digital space, and not an iota of corruption was pointed to anybody else. On the coals, also the same thing. So I think what we are seeing is this government is trying to use digital to leverage not only just on its delivery of services, but it's going to start using more and more training and skill enhancement of its citizens itself. I think Make in India, if you look at, has been focused a lot by this government. In fact, I was there in February for the Make in India launch. I think the overall objective today of the government is to take 15% of its GDP, which is based on manufacturing, to 25% by 2025. And the overall objective is to create roughly 90 million jobs by 2025 in manufacturing segment. I think the challenge are multi-faced there in that environment. For example, when I talk about Make in India, and let's compare this to China, roughly 10 years ago, 16% of the GDP of India was in manufacturing. And last 10 years, the share of manufacturing has come down to now 15%. The trend has been more on a downward trajectory, but more also from the perspective of services have grown much, much faster, so the ratio has shifted more into the services area. What's fascinating is when you look at China, while India came down 1%, in the same period, China grew its manufacturing economy from 17.3% to 24.1%. And as China is slowing down, the thinking in India is that manufacturing is going to come to India itself. But when you look at the reality, that's not happening. When you look at the trend is to move manufacturing from China more into Vietnam, Cambodia, to Burma, and other geographies in Eastern Asia rather than moving into India for multiple reasons itself, and I'll get into that at a later stage itself. So I think for Make in India effort to be successful, India has to go many, many steps to be able to attract tremendous amount of manufacturing coming into the country. But what's interesting is we are seeing, especially from our member companies, from US IBC, is that last year we saw roughly $15 billion of investment coming in from the US into India itself. And we just did a survey of our members, and the partial result which we are seeing is that the next 2 years planned investment by US companies in India is moving from 15 to $27 billion. So I think the confidence level in the boardroom is gone on the positive side, and that's moving in a very, very strong fashion. And I can talk about examples of a US company, for example, General Motors. They have a planned investment of expanding their plants in India, where they are able to they manufacture roughly 130,000 cars a year, and they want to take it to 250,000 by 2025. So they're investing a lot. Ford Motor Company is doing the same thing. On the pharma side, we're seeing Abbott, we're seeing Pfizer. All of them are moving their research center and also moving a lot of their manufacturing into the India itself. I think the challenge all of these face is simplification process of moving goods. So I think hopefully the GST fiasco, which continues, hopefully will come down in some quick manner, so a lot of these companies are able to move goods from one state to another. And also India becomes a stronger part of the global supply chain, because one of the big issues the country is facing is it is still not part of global supply chain, because when you bring partial finished goods into the country, they face a lot of custom duties, delay, and once they manufacture and they send out, the complexity on excise duty and movement of goods itself. So I think the challenge is to simplify the process. And we have been working very, very closely with India. And what we are saying is focus on 4 or 5 areas for the economy to move in the right direction. I think the first is ease of doing business. If you look at the ranking India has today is 130 out of 189 economies, ranking done by the World Bank. And India has moved 12 points, but I believe that some of the effort the government has put in the last 12 to 18 months, it will move much, much faster, almost close to 100 itself. And what's interesting is in the last 12 months, this government has removed roughly 1,700 old laws to improve doing business in India itself. Either they're central laws or state-level laws, but much more needs to be done to attract some of the investment moving out or manufacturing moving out of China into the other geographies itself. I think the other is infrastructure. We have done the analysis, and what we are seeing is the country needs roughly $1 trillion of infrastructure investment. And that is still not coming in. If you look at the local infrastructure companies such as L&T, they're financially in trouble because of the bad contracts they picked up. The big challenge the country has is to be able to attract large investment in infrastructure to be able to build roads, ports, and definitely get into affordable housing. In fact, our discussion 2 weeks ago with the Prime Minister was that in the next 7 years, he wants to build 50 million houses in Tier 2, Tier 3 cities to be able to move, not only just create jobs, but also be able to provide housing. And what's fascinating is, and we've done analysis, that infrastructure does have a large impact on the cost of doing business itself, because of the world average, goods move roughly 500 kilometers a day on a truck. In India, it moves roughly 250 kilometers. And that does have an impact on inventory, which are stuck on the truck because they can't meet either at the plants or the final destination where it needs to be sold. The other factor is look at the ports. I mean, say the average time to load and unload a ship in any of the ports in India is 4 days, as you compare benchmark with either Singapore or Hong Kong, which is 10 to 12 hours. So I think that has to be improved. We did talk about labor reforms, and I think but because of the upper house issue, this government is going state by state and trying to move labor reforms. But I think when you look at the current scenario, especially in manufacturing environment, only 16% of the labor force has permanent jobs. The rest are all contract workers. And I think, and that creates what I call it a two-tier working environment. And if you look at what happened in Maruti plant in Haryana a couple of years ago, it was a basically a fight between the contract workers and permanent laborers, and that's what made the plant shut down for a couple of weeks. In fact, the HR head also died in the process. So I think labor reform has to move much more aggressively to be able to scale up the manufacturing environment. The other is IPR. I think we have advised the government to come out with a world-class IPR policy. The Prime Minister has committed and has talked about protection of patents when he meets with multinational companies, especially on the farmer side. And we are hoping in the next 2 to 4 weeks, we will see a world-class IPR document. We have given the feedback, and one thing I can tell you is government is listening to a lot, taking the feedback very seriously, and we expect to see that IPR coming into the environment. The other is bureaucracy reform. I think when we look at the bureaucracy, yes, the top, I would say, 50 senior bureaucrats are functioning, they are available, they are accessible, but when you go down, percolate down to the rest of bureaucracy, the change is still not there. And we believe that that change will take some time to come, because the intent of this government is to make sure that there's no corruption, make sure that there's accountability among bureaucracy. And I think so that change is moving, but moving very, very slowly. And you have to understand, the business is not done on the central level. Factories are set up on the state level. And unless the reforms comes down to that level, it gets very, very difficult for people to execute some of the plans they have. But it's fascinating. You know, I was talking to Ford company. They set up a massive plant in Gujarat. And the day they broke the ground and the day they started doing their first manufacturing, it was the fastest plant they built in their history anywhere in the world itself. So with all these issues, you can get a lot of things done if you are in the right state itself. So what is happening, what we are seeing is this government is trying to create a competition within the state itself. And so it has moved Planning Commission and brought in Niti Aayog, and whose job is to make sure that states are coordinating with the federal government, and there's a coordination of policy among the state itself, and they are the one who are also looking at which state is going to be ranked 1, 2, 3 on ease of doing business itself. So, and the final thing which we have recommended to the government is that no global power, no global economy has grown without being export-driven. So India has to basically look at how it becomes part of the international, I would say, pacts which are taking place. If TPP, for whatever reason, comes into force, India will lose overnight roughly around $500+ billion worth of on GDP, because countries like Vietnam will move more of the, such as garment from Vietnam into the US itself, almost zero duty, whereas Indian garment exporter faces roughly 25 to 30% duty itself. So I think you will see a massive impact on India. So what we have recommended to the country is that it seriously consider joining first APEC. So we are expecting the Prime Minister to raise in his working lunch with the President here that is intent to participate in APEC. It is a slow process, it's a complex process, because you have treaty partners with US such as Colombia, which also had expressed a desire to join APEC. And I think the priority will be given to the treaty partners first rather than India itself. But we're expecting that there will be some kind of priority given if the Prime Minister raises the request to join APEC. So on that note, I will stop and basically get into Q&A and be glad to answer whatever limited time I have on the Q&A side. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this very brilliant talk. Now, you are looking after both the sides of business from the Indian perspective and from the US perspective. Now, how do you feel would be the aspect of the Indian side in terms of doing business with US, the promise and the perils? Because recently we were doing some seminars in different cities in India with the corporate sectors. and this came up repeatedly. So your perspective, your take on that, and your vision of how these relations, particularly between the corporate sectors, can somehow support and fuel the overarching relationship between India and US to become possibly the defining relationship for the 21st century.
I think our study shows Indian companies have invested in the last 5 years roughly $20 billion in the US, creating roughly 100,000 jobs across the US itself. I think from an investment perspective, the Indian companies are not facing any issue with the exception of on the services side. I think you can't have a trade agreement which is focused purely on manufacturing side. You also have to incorporate services side. And India is, a 55% services economy. And so the legislation on H-1B, we have stated openly in the that it is discriminatory towards Indian companies. And you can't have a relationship where you are basically saying, let's drive trade, but at the same time penalize on the services side. So I think that is a challenge, and we're working with the Congress to see how we can address that issue. I think the partnership is going to be driven between these two nations on three broad areas. One is definitely on the trade side. I think when I talk about India's tsunami of young people coming into the job market, there's no other country who can provide better technology. There's no other country who can provide better capital than the US itself. Yes, we are seeing the Japanese and the Koreans putting the flags in India, but the level, the capacity of the technology capital, I think on the US can only provide that. So I think from that perspective, and the market in India is lucrative. I mean, see, you look at companies such as IBM, Cisco, pharma side, they all are showing growth of 10 to 15% on an annual basis itself. So the market is there. And if you look at it from a technology perspective, India is now the largest buyer of US defensive equipment, surpassing Russia, where India used to buy from Russia. So I think from a trade perspective, we would like to see movement going from $100 billion trade to $500 billion. And more important is, I think it's important for stable India to be able to create more jobs in the country itself. The other factor is defense. I think if there's a vacuum, and when I say defense, geopolitically, the rise of China is an opportunity and threat for both countries. I think if you create a vacuum in Asia where US is not there or India is not there, then that vacuum will be occupied by China. And so I think both of India's and US interests are aligned to make sure that there's a stable China, there's a stable India working with each other on job front, trade front, rather than creating opportunity which is hegemonic itself. And that can create a little more crisis in the region itself. The third factor is culture. I mean, it's a democracy, the value system between the two countries. India ships roughly around 120,000 students every year. And if, let's say, 50%, 60% do go back to India, they become the brand ambassador for the country. I mean, say, open press. Yes, you can question some of the press scenario in India itself, but I think culturally countries are aligned, geopolitically countries are aligned, and from a business perspective, they are aligned. And I think you will see the relationship moving forward. It'll have its hiccups. The WTO filing on solar panel was a hiccup, but I think as the partnership deepens, broadens, you will have these hiccups, and I think there's maturity on both sides to be able to handle and manage this.
So first of all, thank you for your very interesting talk, and I particularly liked the way you gave such a succinct summary of the reform agenda in all directions. I want you to elaborate a bit more on the regional disparity of foreign investment. So put it in context, I'm from Bihar, And you gave a lovely example of Gujarat. What will it take for Ford to go to Bihar?
Well, Bihar just got the biggest contract from GE to set up their locomotive plants. I think you have to, I'll give you a very interesting scenario. If you look at what's happening in India, is if you look at southern states, Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, Maharashtra, Gujarat. If you look at them, on the average, they are growing between 10 to 12%. And so as economically they're growing, what we are seeing is also the child birth rate is also coming down. Mortality rate is going up, but they're having lesser children. In the north, UP, Bihar, also Madhya Pradesh, what we are seeing is economically they are not growing as fast as these states. Also, the birth rate is growing much faster than the rest of the country. And as you know, democracy is based on representation of member of parliament. And if you look at the last 30 years, the ratio of number of parliaments coming in from north is going up, while the economic contribution from south is going up, but the ratio of representation is coming down. So what we are seeing is a political division taking place. And if this continues in the next 30 years, the southern states will say, hey, we don't want to be part of northern states itself. But to answer your question, I think one is perception management. I think if you look at both UP, Bihar, as two states, they have made a lot of reforms, especially Bihar, on the girl-child movement, on the education side. But the perception management is not there still, and they need to fix that. Yes, they have to do realistic reforms, but I feel you have to do more perception management. I meet almost on a weekly basis different chief minister delegation coming in. In the last 12 months, I've not seen a single delegation come from Bihar or UP to attract investment. So I think we need to be able to encourage work with Bihar and also with UP to make sure that investment goes in. But we also have to fix this law and order situation. Because once you go past Greater Noida area in UP, it becomes very difficult on the law and order itself. So I think when you look at the southern states like Gujarat and Andhra Pradesh, they manage this very, very well. So it will take time, but I feel that things will move in the right direction in the state of Bihar. Yes.
Hi, Mukesh. Thanks for your comments. You touched upon manufacturing and services. I want to ask a question on agriculture. India is growing at 7.5% per year, but the last 2 years, agriculture sector has grown at 0.1% both years. Of course, the monsoons have failed too, both years. So going forward, how do you see US IBC playing a facilitative role, number one, to get more American investment into the rural sector? And I'll give a specific example, which is preventing post-harvest loss of food. India, only 2% of food is processed. A lot of it goes to waste. So to reduce food inflation, a kind of easy win is how do you reduce post-harvest loss? So how do you get American investment into the food processing sector? And going forward, how do you get American research universities and innovative technologies deployed to the rural sector to increase productivity and get that surplus labor into manufacturing? Thank you.
Well, let me give you a scenario of the agriculture environment. Yes, last 2 years, monsoons have failed. And as you know, agriculture still is the largest employer. But what's interesting is if you look at as the land ownership goes down among children, today the average plot of a farm is half the size of a regular football field. So what happens is the efficiency goes away. And whereas in the US, farming has gone more to the corporate environment rather than the individual. So all the technology equipments are based more on massive farms rather than the Indian environment. The second is the overuses of pesticides. And so a lot of these bugs have become resistant to pesticide. India has to start thinking of basically using GM, and that's very controversial. And we can't say, but I think India did start using on the cotton side, and Monsanto did build up a local seed for that. But recently there was a massive resistance to pricing, and basically the country forced Monsanto to drop the price by 70%. And they're saying that if we drop the price by 70%, we'll do that, but we won't have enough money, not enough money for the next generation of the cotton seeds. Because the current one is, again, we are seeing, is becoming what you call it's no longer resisting to the bugs itself. So I think it's a complex issue, it's a political issue also. But what we are encouraging the US government, especially the US companies, to look at India slightly different long-term itself. And one of the key things we are focused on is more on the cold supply chain management. If you look at 35% of the products get wasted as they go through the process itself. So we are working with a lot of large companies to move in, but there are certain complex issues on the duty side which we're working with the Prime Minister and his office to sort that out. It is an important issue. And what we're seeing is more interest coming from US companies to get into India, but we need to make things easy for these companies to go establish plants, be able to move in special equipment where they have a lot of duties on it, and be able to bring in the second green revolution, which we're hoping for that. So it's a long, long effort, but we are, as a council, are very focused on trying to make sure one area, agriculture, takes off in India itself. I am out of my time. Thank you very much, and have a good day.